Okay, so this is another relevant question, which is, when do I tithe my income? How often, what time of year should I be doing it, and so forth. So here's the shaila. The inyan zman hafrashas ma'aser ksafim. Sheila is mahu azman hanachon lahafrish ma'aser ksafim. So remember, we learned that tithing is a long-standing custom. According to the Taz, it's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. According to other poskim, it's not a mitzvah at all, and certainly, therefore, it's an advocated practice, but we cannot say definitively that it's an obligation. But certainly, it's a very worthy, noble thing to do. So, based on that, the question is, when should a person tithe his assets? Misha mitparnes mimasa umatan shelifa'amim marviach v'lifa'im mafsid. So if a person is in a type of business where the income, it's not a paid salary, but rather it's fluctuates his income. Let's see, he's a realtor, a real estate broker, or he runs a business. He's a businessman and he sells goods. And sometimes he has good months and sometimes he has bad months. He's a car salesman, who knows, whatever, it could be anything. Or in any other situation where he's not able to determine how much profit he's made. Nasnu aposkim shiur shel chatzi shona o shana kedei la'asot cheshbon u'lenakot ha'hefseid me'harevach. He says, in that kind of scenario, the poskim give a person either 6 months to a year so that he can make an accounting at the end of a certain period of time to know how much his profits have been. See, if you get a regular salary and your income is static from month to month, so you should probably just, every paycheck, just slice off a portion off the top, right? But if your income fluctuates and there's so many variables, a lot of times you have to take into account expenses versus income and so many other variables. It's not practical to tithe as the money comes in. So therefore, the poskim say that you can take 6 months to a year in order to make your cheshbon. Ula mishu hu sachir, but if a person is an employee, yoter nachon la'aser miyad kishemekabel hamaskoret shelo. Then it's more appropriate to take your meiser as soon as you get your payment, as soon as you get your paycheck. Vim oto sachir mekabel kitzva mi bituach leumi. If this employee also receives an amount from bituach leumi, which is the national, I guess, the pension fund, or I think that's what bituach leumi is. That what it is? I think so. So mehanachon likboa gam et hazman shemekabel ota kitzva lahafrasha v'nimtza shehu tzarich lahafrish pamayim b'chodesh. So then he should tithe that amount also, and therefore he would tithe twice a month. In other words, whenever he gets those income checks coming in, that's when he would do the tithing. Okay, so that's the entirety of the we have to continue. He says, Achadvarim amurim rak legabe misha mafresh meiser ksafim mikol harevachim shelo ve'eno menake mehem shum hotzaot. He says that's only referring to a person who simply tithes his paycheck, and that's it. He doesn't take into account any of his expenses, right? Which is probably the most generous way to tithe. However, or every month he knows how much he has to deduct from his paycheck for the rent, utilities, etc., tuition, etc. Okay, but kagon schar limud shel banot o hotzaot nesiya la'avodato v'chayotze bo, such as the amount that he has to pay for his daughter's education or his expenses for transportation back and forth from work. He knows that he pays X amount of dollars or shekels per month. And so therefore he immediately deducts that from his paycheck. And with the balance, he tithes. Ulam legabe mishmenake meharevachim shelo hotzaot shanot she'inan yeduot lo merosh. But if a person knows that he's going to have expenses that he wishes to deduct from his paycheck before he tithes, and those are variable expenses, so then it makes sense to only wait until the end of the month to tithe, where you can make a cheshbon at the end of the month, what your expenses were. And then you'll have a better way of calculating what your expenses are, and therefore how much you wish to tithe. Now remember, we saw this in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch as well. The Kitzur had said that you only, for those who tithe, you only have to tithe what you earn after your expenses. And so remember, we had a discussion of what are considered expenses. Things that I don't have to. So first of all, certainly the things that are for the cost of my work, I can certainly deduct. The expenses that I incur, however, for mortgage, rent, utilities, that would also be okay according to the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Not according to all the poskim, but certainly according to the Kitzur. If I have fixed expenses every single month, grocery bills, tuition, etc., etc., etc. So those I can deduct and then look at the profits at the end of the month. For some people, those profits are very, very small indeed. And then I can tithe that amount. Okay? So it really all depends on first of all, what shita a person is going to subscribe to. And it also depends on, whether he's going to tithe. But because it's a proper thing to tithe, because it's recommended to tithe, a person should try to make sure that he has a way of accounting for all of his expenses before he does the actual tithe. Okay, let me see if there's any additional paragraph here. Okay, no, so let's take a look at the biurim. Let's take a look at his analysis down below. So he says as follows. He says, Yesh la'ayin mahu azman hanachon la'aser. So let's look into what is the right time to tithe. Uveshut shar Ephraim nakat shekol echad yachol ligbo azman la'atzmo ela she'ein la'acher yoter me'shana. In the Chuvas Shar Ephraim, he writes that a person could really set up any time frame that he wishes, provided that it's not longer than a year from the time of his earnings. V'zelushono she'im b'shah shahayalo hefsid hayalo cheshbon shahayalo hefsid v'imkein ma shahayalo revach achar kach hu inyan acher ve'eno mimalei harevach et hahefsid. He says a person can incur a loss one time of the year and then gain a profit at another time of the year, which he says ve'eno mimalei harevach et hahefsid. He says, we don't say necessarily that the profit offsets the loss. Aval im lo hayalo cheshbon at tom hashana v'chashav kol hacheshbonos harevach ve'efsid mikol hashana az yimali ha'efsid min harevach ad kam l'shana. He says, the benefit of waiting a year is that you can offset your losses with your profits. So in other words, if you were to tithe, let's say, more regularly than once a year, you could have a month where you incur a loss. So you don't tithe, but you don't give yourself anything either. And then if you wait and then the next month you get a huge profit, you would say, well, if I'm tithing once a month, then based on my profits from this month, I should tithe everything of my profits. He says that's not necessarily the best way to do it, because that your profits are not going to offset your losses. But if you tithe at the end of the year and see what your net profits are, so then you you have a balance sheet that basically where the losses are offset by the profits, and therefore your profits are less, and that's really the more accurate way of tithing. V'chayotze bazeh kasav b'shut chavas yoyer, shekol echad yachol likboa zman hamiyuchad lazeh pam b'chatzi shana o pam b'gimel chadashim. The chavas yoyer also says the same thing. He says either once every 6 months, once every 3 months, v'zeh l'shono. V'nira demisha nahag v'rotze lotzes yidei shamayim yihiyelo pinkas miyuchad l'ma'asro. He says, it seems to me that the best way to do this is that you should have a special ledger just for your tzedakah. And set aside one day every 3 months or every 6 months, where you can make an accounting, where you could basically write, you're recording in your little notebook all of your profits and losses. And at the end of a period, you then calculate how much your tithe would come out to once you've calculated all your expenses, all your losses, and all your profits. And then you go to the next period. The next period should not offset the previous period because you've decided that this is how you want to calculate it. Now, notice that no one's advocating that you could do this over the course of 10 years. In other words, why not say 10 years? Say, like, let's say after 10 years, I'll calculate. Well, so like in 2015, I had a bad year. I depleted all my savings. In 2016, I started to make a little bit of money. 2000. So you could play the books that way and then come out with a smaller amount. So no one's advocating that you should take a multi-year calculation. It should be at least once a year. Here we're seeing poskim advocating for more frequently than once a year, either twice a year or once every 3 months. Then he quotes from the Noda B'Yehuda. He says, "Kulam b'shut Noda B'Yehuda dacha divrei Hashar Ephraim." And he writes, "Va'omnam ra'isi Hashar Ephraim b'simin peidala shedima le'iska v'ichriyah shim kvarchisha v'hefzed shuv v'yefshelo l'nakos hefzed zemin harevach sheyarviach achar ha'cheshbon ma she'ein kein im adayin lo chishev ayin sham v'chol ze etzli dimyon rachok ad kam l'shana." The Rav Yecheskel Landau, the author of the Noda B'Yehuda, says, I don't agree with the premise. What, just because you set aside a 6-month period where you reckoned your profits versus losses, and you took your tithe from that, you can't carry over that to offset your profits next month? What if you had a net loss in the last period? Why can't you use that to offset your profits in the next period of time, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, etc.? He says, I don't see why that should be true. He says, that's simply arbitrary, in my opinion, he says. The cost of behemshech dvaros, and so he includes, in the course of his discussion, he writes, shetzarech la'aser pa'am b'shana. He says once a year is sufficient. V'zeh l'shana, v'hinei omer ani degam shana shana dekosav kra, darshinan gam kein li'inin meiser ksafim. Aser ta'aser eit vuatz zarecha hayotze lachem shana shana. The Torah says that you shall surely tithe all of your agriculture that is produced by the field every year. Why does the Torah say shana shana, every year? So the Noda B'Yehuda suggests that that's also at least something that you can rely upon to tell you that once a year is sufficient to calculate how much tithing you should take. Shekol shana hu cheshbon bifnei atzmo. That every year is its own period of calculation. Aval al kol panim chazinin da Yerushalmi direi kra shana shana v'lachein kasva toisus v'harash v'chol shana yitin chomesh harevach ve'al kol panim midizachru b'chol shana michal shekol hashana l'cheshbon echad shayach ad kan l'shana. What you see from, says the Noda B'Yehuda, without getting into too much of the details, but actually the Talmud Yerushalmi quotes that pasuk to tell me that an annual cycle for tithing is a thing. And therefore, you can certainly use that as your criterion to say that if the first half of the year you were actually dipping into your savings because you weren't clearing any profits at all, and so you actually were working at a deficit, and then the second half of the year you started working at a profit, you can use the first half of the year to offset the profits in the second half of the year. But you shouldn't go beyond a year. That's what Rav Landau paskins. It says, "Ve'od gam b'shut shvus Yaakov cholak al hachavos yor v'ashar Ephraim v'kosav she'en lenakos ha'hefsed mimakom echad mimasher v'ich mimakom acher rak im kan hakol b'vasachas umashma shemiyad she'erviach u'hazman la'aser." The shvus Yaakov, however, is more machmir, and he says that as soon as you get the income, you should tithe. Ulam tzarechiyim. He says, so we really have to think about this. He says, why shouldn't you have to tithe as soon as the profits come in? He says, couldn't one argue that as soon as you make the money, you should immediately have to tithe it? And Beis lachashosh l'shitas hataz denokat sheyesh l'maiser din maiser ani mamish. He says, and according to the Taz, whatever my cash income is no different from my agricultural income, where the Torah tells me that I'm supposed to take maiser ani right away. Uvetosvus kosvu sheyesh iser la'achar maiser ani gam lifnei hafrasha la'achar gemar malacha. Tosfos writes that as soon as you finish bringing the grain from the field into your granary, you immediately then have an obligation to tithe. You're not allowed to delay the tithing. And therefore, you make the same argument. According to the Taz, at least, your obligation to tithe should be as soon as the check clears in the bank. So as soon as you can use the grain, you become obligated to tithe it. As soon as you can use the money that you've brought in, you should have an obligation to tithe. Gimel lachshosh l'shitas hamaharil shenakat sha'as lihanos mimamon she'ena me'usar. And furthermore, another argument to be machmir is the maharil, who says that you're not even allowed to benefit from any income before it's tithed, just like you can't benefit from grain before it's tithed, which sounds like really the most machmir, right? Va'od navik kan mashakasav b'rishon l'tzion v'zel l'shona. Let's also quote for you from this sefer called Rishon LeZion, who says that shir mitzvah zu yesh kama pratim. He says in calculating this mitzvah, there are many details. Ha'echad da'afilu mibeli tovim oso mitzvah la adam lahafrish mimamanu tzedako lachapes al ha'ani l'sita lo v'hafrashi echas me'asar. He says, number one, and we remember we deliberated over this in the Aruch HaShulchan, the mitzvah of tzedakah is calculated based on the need, not based on a person's ability. Now, remember, we saw in the Aruch HaShulchan that he gave us this. It's charity is a social contract that I have with the society in which I live, and which is, I think, a good way of looking at it. If we wanted to sort of give it some kind of philosophical label. It's a social contract that when I live in a society, I have to provide for the poor of my society. So it's based on the need, not based upon my income. If there are very few poor people, so then I don't have to give as much. If there are more poor people, then I have to give so much, so long as I don't impoverish myself in the process, which is why the rabbis put a cap on 20%. Okay? But that's different from the mitzvah of Meiser, which is tithing 10% of your income. And that is a separate mitzvah. That seems to be what the consensus of the poskim is, that independent of the social needs of the community in which I live, I'm supposed to tithe 10% of my income and find a place to spend it. Find a place where I can park that money, where it will be put to good use for a mitzvah, independent of the needs of the society. Okay? That's what the Rishon LeZion writes. He says, "V'raya lezeh," to prove this point, "Mimad isa b'sifri aser ta'aser, arei dedam yelamayser." He says, a proof to this is the fact that the Medrash compares tithing your income to tithing your agriculture. And tithing your agriculture is independent of the social need, of the social contract. A person has an obligation to tithe his agriculture, irrespective of whether there are poor people or not. So, umizah talame dahavya kamaiser dahagam de'en lo taveya lo yipater mila aser ya'aser v'yaniach ad sheyimtza levi laseslo. And so what you see from that mitzvah in agricultural tithing is that, let's say you're taking regular meiser that you give to the Levi, but there are no Levium in your community. Let's say you live in Ashkelon, and all of the Levium, there are no Levium in Ashkelon. So does that mean that your fields are pater from meiser? No, you tithe your grain, you put it in a sack, and you say, the next time a Levi comes to visit my community, or the next time I'm traveling to Ashdod, where I know that I can find Levium, I'll drop off the sack to the Levium. It says, "V'yesh b'zeh mitzvahs aseh, aval ein b'lav eladavkim b'ha'ani v'sho'ali nami sheyodea sheyesh ani nitzrach v'hu ma'alim ayin ad kan l'shana." And he says, the only time that there's a negative commandment that you're not allowed to hide from giving to the poor is only when there are poor people present. But if there are no poor people present, there's only a positive mitzvah of tithing, not a negative commandment that you may not hide your eye. So So what he wants to, the author wishes to infer from this is that you see from this whole language that he's presented in this paragraph, that tithing is something that needs to be done right away, regardless of whether you can find a poor person, but also as it applies to our discussion, you should have to tithe immediately before any calculus as far as losses versus profits. V'lachein, I think that's a weak argument. Personally, I don't see that at all is what the Rishon LeZion is getting at from that small paragraph that he's quoted. But certainly, based on the power of the previous questions, where if you're going to compare, which is what the Taz does. Remember, we said that the Taz is a machmir on the laws of tithing. If you're going to compare regular cash income to agricultural tithing, so then you should become obligated to tithe immediately and not take into account the expenses that went into the production of the field. I mean, and I think that this is a weak argument because ultimately all of the poskim agree that it's not a perfect analogy to agricultural tithing. When I tithe my produce, am I allowed to deduct my expenses in the fertilizer, the seeds, that I had to hire, the animals that I had to rent to plow the field, et cetera, et cetera? I'm not allowed to take those into account. So clearly, the laws of tithing, my income, are not perfectly analogous to tithing agriculture. But based on the force of these questions above, v'lachein niralanias daiti, shekola poskim hanal, asher daitem hi shalom afrishim miyad, dibru legabe misha misparnes mimasa umatan, shelifa'amim marviach v'lifa'amim mafsid. He says, that's why in my initial response that he wrote on the top part of the page, he felt that only a person who has an irregular type of income, a revenue stream, where some months he does better and some months he does worse, only in those situations should a person rely on deferring tithing to a longer period of time. Or if there's no way for him to calculate what his profits are because he needs to wait till end of year so that he can calculate all of his expenses and his losses. And only then should you wait 6 months to a year to do your accounting and come up with a number that you wish to tithe. Ulam lagabi mishu hu sachir l'kulei alma tachul chavasu la'aser miyad kishiyuchal lihishtamesh b'maskoret shalom. But if you're a salaried employee, you know exactly what your monthly expenses are. You know exactly what your income is. So then you should have to tithe as soon as possible. And that, for that reason, I feel that you should establish a monthly period where when you pay all your bills at the end of the month and you calculate what your profits are, you know exactly what it is. You should immediately store some away for Meiser. V'im hasacher misparnes gamkein mikitzva mibituach leumi mehanachon ani asdaiti likvoa games hazman shemakabel ota kitzva lahafrasha v'nimtza shu tzarich lahafrish pamayim b'chodesh. And if you're getting something from bituach leumi, which is sort of like a social welfare program. I'm not sure which social welfare is, but I've heard of Bituach Leumi before. I just don't remember how it's translated exactly, but I don't even know whether it even applies anymore. It's one of these Bituach Leumi is social security. That's literally what it means. Social security, Bituach Leumi. So if you're getting Social Security on top of, or some kind of pension or Social Security check from the government, so then you should tithe as soon as you get that check in also. So that would be twice a month, once for your salary and once for your Social Security check. So we'll hold it here for today, just to save that last paragraph for tomorrow, and then we'll do the next tshuva. Okay, have a great day, everybody.